So the people who bought shares in ships, like, for example, Queen Isabella financing Columbus, they really expected to get a serious financial return.
Right.
It wasn't just, let's see if we can make a map of, you know, the new world.
No,
In fact, they didn't even know there was a
right.
new
No,
world.
what they wanted were commodities for
Right.
trade.
And so he was actually going west, if I remember right, looking for a northwest passage to the Spice Islands and all, so that he could bring back lots of loot. I've been to Portugal and seen the incredible, and Spain also, the unbelievable riches in the churches there, because those have survived. You know, the silver altars, the gold, the jewels, and all the rest of it. And it's sort of hard to imagine the sheer raw dollars, if you will, they brought back in terms of, you know, these new countries, these new places where they found things.
Yeah, the wealth of the Spanish and Portuguese empires at their height is, I think, just impossible to conceive. The amount of ships laden with nothing but gold coming back to the home country.
Absolutely, and of course as the trade moved, I've always found this interesting because I've also been to Venice in recent times, and that whole Venice-Istanbul, you know, trade on the Adriatic. Istanbul was the gateway to the east then, and a lot of it funneled through Venice, and then as these Western countries began to explore and trade and open up the Atlantic, Venice really lost its commercial power and kind of turned into what? A tourist destination and perpetual carnival.
Right, but it was, as you say, a major trading city for much of the late medieval,
right,
early
and there were
modern
horrible
period.
penalties for people who violated a lot of rules for Venetian commerce and trade. And I was looking today, there's a book that has just come out. Well, one which I kind of enjoyed was a major publisher publishing This Glorious History of Goldman Sachs, which just came out this month, and I was thinking their timing was not
Worse
wonderful.
worse than mine, certainly.
Well, yours is actually kind of interesting, but the other had to do with the Opium Wars and the fact that the British actually, you know, grew opium, got it from Afghanistan, India, and all, and took it to China as a commodity they could trade, so that they could bring back porcelain and silks or whatever, and they were perfectly okay with the idea of, you know, creating this huge addiction and causing all sorts of stuff in the interest of trade. I guess it wasn't that much different than that whole slave rum sugar triangle in the West.
But you know, one of the things that I find so interesting about the opium trade is that the way it was managed was just so maliciously, because there were movements at times among the Chinese people to try and limit opium.
Right.
And the British, and that's what the Opium Wars, you know, they wanted to make sure that nobody would push back against their supplying of opium, because there was so much trade that depended on it.
Yeah, I think there's a stereotype. I mean, in detective fiction, if you read Sherlock Holmes or whatever, of, you know, the kind of opium-soaked Chinese, and you tend to think that was the Chinese and the Chinese culture and whatever. Well, not true.
Right.
You know, they were actually made that way, and there's a lot of, I think, analogies you can make to modern drug wars. I mean, one way, this is a view I've really come around to, although it sounds kind of heinous, but if you think of the amount of power that we have handed other countries because of the illegal drug trade, and if you go back and look at Prohibition and think about the effect that the illegal alcohol trade had on crime in America, on the rise of Capone and all that sort of thing, it makes you wonder whether, if we just took the money out of it, you know, legalized it.
No, I think, you know, it's one of those issues where I think intellectually it's really hard to argue against a thoughtful and well-regulated decriminalization of many drugs. But no politician could ever sell that.
I agree.
You know, I think it's, if you could manage it in such a way that you could continue to limit usage, especially among minors, but also, as you say, take out the economic quotient, I think supply would eventually just really dwindle.
Well, sure it would. I mean, I think that, as I said, we were in Canada recently, and we went to those little two islands, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, which are actually French. They are not French colonies. They are a department of France, and they are 12 kilometers or 15 off Canada's coast. And that was where Capone had his headquarters during Prohibition, because Canada could sell alcohol legally to any country that didn't have Prohibition. So they were just floated over there to these two little islands, which were French, and then Capone and his guys would take over. and here it would come, you know,
Oh, that's
down the
interesting.
coast and into America. The part I loved the best was that they never had any natural wood supply on these two little islands. They were pretty windswept, and they were there really for the cod trade. They had these big rocky beaches, and they could pull the cod out, dry it on the rocks before refrigeration, and salt it down, and that was a big food supply thing. Anyway, the whiskey that came in from Canada came in wooden crates, and it was so noisy that they would rush to unpack it and swaddle it up in sailcloth and other things so that the customs agents wouldn't hear it, with the result that there were these mountains of wooden staves from all these things piled up on the island, so they were able then to use it all for building material.
That's interesting.
Isn't that fun?
Yeah, that is.
I love learning stuff
Yeah.
like that. I always think of you when I do that, you know, that David would be interested in these kinds of things.
Well, it is so interesting how these happenstances of history tend to produce these cultural manifestations that seem natural and inevitable, that are just the result of very specific moments and the demands of very specific moments. I think that's a good example of that.
I also think it lends itself really well to the crime novel because, I mean, really, basically, to make a thriller or a crime novel work, you have to have some engine. I mean, generally, the engines are sex and money. And all of this stuff produces, in fact, serious financial risk and reasons for people to kill each other or war against each other.
Right.
It's been great for you.
Well, you know, I mean, I like to write books about things that people don't think they will find interesting, but then do, I hope.
Well, I certainly did. I remember A Conspiracy of Paper, for which you won the Edgar Award,
Yes.
and I'm trying to remember. There were like 2 other awards that picked up.
The McCavity and the Barry, I think.
Okay. These are awards given in the world of crime fiction
Yeah.
to books and authors of excellence. But it was also, in that time in England, in the early 18th century, was a time of tremendous political and religious turmoil.
Mm-hmm.
Because England had had its fill with Catholics. The Stuarts never quite got it. And James II's daughter Mary and her husband William were invited over in the Glorious Revolution to take over because they didn't want James, who was a Catholic and married to a Catholic, wasn't Mary of Modena? I'm sorry, I could do this for hours. Anyway, didn't want them on the throne.
Well,
But they also,
the issue was when James and Mary had a
the baby,
child.
the warming pan
Right,
baby.
because that suddenly suggested Catholic dynasty. Because before the child, it seemed like, well, eventually, you know, he has these 2 Protestant daughters
Right.
that will inherit the throne. But the baby was the last straw.
I blame Charles II. I think that Charles II really blew his obligations as king. This is a man who had, what, like 35 bastard children, and never, you know, put aside the wife that couldn't have children, which was, in one sense, nice, but in one sense, in terms of his obligations
He was a
to the
complicated
state,
guy.
He was a complicated guy, but I've always found it fascinating that even though he could see the potential disaster of dying with no legitimate heir and his brother taking the throne, he just didn't cope.
Well, another way of parsing that is that Charles was himself secretly a Catholic, which I think most historians would probably agree with, and that the idea that his brother, who was openly Catholic, would become king wasn't that distasteful to him.
Could well be. And of course, his own wife was Catherine of Braganza, his wife, who actually brought the first, I think, English territory under British control, right? Her dowry was, I'm almost sure I remember this from some Northwestern University course, but a part of her dowry was one of the Portuguese English territories
Oh, is
or
that
cities.
right? I
Yeah.
did not know that.
And that became sort of nucleus of the whole British presence in India. So maybe there was a problem there. If you put her aside, he'd have to give some of it back.
Right.
Could be. But anyway, England was so determined not to have a Catholic king that when Queen Anne died, again with no children, although the poor woman had had 18, I think, none of whom lived, they brought over from Germany a new dynasty that were Protestant, didn't even speak English.
Right. And they had to skip over something, I forget what the number is, but over 20 different Catholic heirs before they got to the Hanoverian house.
Right, and that was in 1715, and your bubble, your South Sea bubble that's growing and is going to explode is right in that time period, because
Right.
wasn't that, what, 1720 or
begins the Conspiracy of Paper is mostly set in 1719.
Right.
And the bubble actually burst in 1720, and it deals more with the events that lead up to the bubble rather than the actual aftermath